In this video, we're going to cover active transport, and our learning objective is to be able to describe and explain the process of active transport using relevant examples in animals and plants. As always, all of the timestamps will be in the description below, so feel free to skip to whatever part you need help with. This is our only definition for this video, which is active transport. That is the movement of particles from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration against the concentration gradient. There's no required knowledge for this topic, however it would be good to review diffusion and osmosis beforehand, as many of the principles in these topics are relevant to active transport, including the concepts of concentration gradients and the factors which affect the rate of transport across membranes. So, as we know, active transport is the movement of dissolved molecules into or out of a cell through the cell membrane from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration. So, in active transport, the particles move against the concentration gradient using energy in the form of ATP, which is released during respiration. So sometimes we have dissolved molecules at a higher concentration inside the cell than outside the cell. So for example, we've got more pink dots, which are our molecules, which are on the inside of our cell membrane. But because the organism needs these molecules, they still have to be absorbed from the outside at the top of the screen. So then we have specific proteins which are called carrier proteins, so the one in purple. And carrier proteins essentially pick up these molecules and transport them to the other side against the concentration gradient, which goes from the inside to the outside and is indicated by the yellow arrow. And because it's going against the concentration gradient, that means it requires energy, so it's an active process. So examples of active transport which occur in actual organisms are the uptake of glucose by epithelial cells in the villi of the small intestine, and also the uptake of ions from soil water by root hair cells in plants. And in both of these instances, the concentration of a substance is higher on the inside of the cell, but because we need the glucose and the ions for the cell and the organism to survive, we have to carry out active transport in order to absorb all of those molecules. In animals, glucose molecules have to be moved across the gut wall in the intestine into the blood, and there'll be times where the glucose concentration in the intestine might be lower. For example, if you haven't eaten for a while, so you don't have a lot of carbohydrates broken down within your GI tract. And when this is the case, the movement of glucose involves active transport as we're going from a low concentration in the lumen of the intestines to a higher concentration within the blood capillary. And this process requires energy in the form of ATP produced by respiration. A similar process occurs in the root hair cells of plants. So as we can see on the diagram, we've got our root epidermal cell on the right and our root hair on the left. And within soil water, there's a very low concentration of nitrates in the soil and a higher concentration of nitrates within our root hair cell. However, we need to take up as many nitrates as possible, so we get active transport occurring when the nitrates move from the low concentration to the high concentration within the cell. And obviously, as this is active transport, it requires energy in the form of ATP. And in order to meet this demand, root hair cells have a lot of mitochondria which carry out respiration in order to release this energy. These are the two most common mistakes that students make when answering questions on active transport, so make sure you remember these two facts. The first one is that active transport and diffusion can occur across the same membranes. So for example, in the gut, we have active transport when there's a low concentration of glucose in the lumen of the intestine, but a high concentration in the blood capillary. However, for example, if you've just eaten, there's going to be a high concentration of glucose in the lumen and maybe a slightly lower concentration within the blood. So that means diffusion can occur down the concentration gradient, and which process is occurring when depends on the relative concentrations on both sides of the membrane. Second fact is that molecules move through proteins and not the actual membrane itself. So this is a small kind of distinction from diffusion, whereas in diffusion, the molecules are diffusing across the phospholipid membrane. In active transport, molecules are transported through specific carrier proteins which are embedded within the membrane. This is our first worked example question for active transport. So epithelial cells also carry out active transport. Name one food molecule absorbed into epithelial cells by active transport. So we can just go for the example that we've covered earlier in the video, which is going to be glucose, which is obviously really important as it's a substrate for respiration. So we'll put glucose for that question. Secondly, why is it necessary to absorb some food molecules by active transport? So obviously with the example in the intestine, if we have a low concentration within the lumen of the intestine but a high concentration in our blood, we still want to absorb as much glucose as possible from our food, otherwise there's not really a point in eating the food in the first place. So we need active transport when we're moving from a low to a high concentration, or when we're going against the concentration gradient. So low to high concentration. Thirdly, suggest why epithelial cells have many mitochondria. So active transport is an active process. It requires energy in the form of ATP, and ATP is produced during the process of aerobic respiration, which occurs in mitochondria. And so that's why epithelial cells have so many, because they carry out a lot of active transport within the gut especially. So need energy and then respiration, which occurs in our mitochondria. Now we're going to try a slightly harder second worked example, so make sure to pause the screen and have a go at it yourself, and then I'm going to go through it. Some plants can be grown in water using the technique of hydroponics. The roots are in water and supplied with the ions that they need at the concentrations that support maximum growth. Some ions can be absorbed by both diffusion and by active transport. State two features of diffusion that do not apply to active transport. So for this first question, we need to have a knowledge of diffusion and active transport and essentially be able to compare both processes. So first off, we can start thinking about the features of active transport and then explain how they differ to diffusion. So obviously the main characteristic of active transport is that it's active, so it requires energy, and we know that diffusion is a passive process which does not require energy. So we can put that diffusion is passive and there's no energy required. And the reason why we need energy within active transport is because we're going against the concentration gradient, which we're not doing in diffusion. As in diffusion, we're going from our high concentration to our low concentration. So that could be a second point, we're going against the concentration gradient. In terms of other points that you could put down, you could also say that diffusion does not have to occur across a membrane. So if you've watched the diffusion video, you've seen the example of, for example, spraying an air freshener in a room, and the particles will over time spread across the room until they are evenly distributed. And obviously that's just occurring in open air. We don't necessarily need a membrane or any specific carrier proteins in order for that diffusion to take place. And also diffusion occurs in gases and liquids, whereas active transport uses specific kind of molecules which are not present. The second question is explain how roots are adapted to absorb ions. So this goes back to our example of the root hair cell. So we can think about the features of that cell and then explain why that would maximize the rate or ability to carry out active transport. So first, just thinking about the overall structure. Obviously we have the long projection of the root hair, so it looks a bit like this if you can't remember. So we've got our kind of epidermal cell here, and then we've got a long projection, which is the root hair part of the cell. So that's the root hair. And because it is sticking out from the rest of the cell, it does increase the surface area, which helps to increase the rate of uptake. So we can put down that the large surface area helps to increase the rate of active transport. So another point is that because active transport requires lots of energy, we also have lots of mitochondria in roots which respire and release this energy for this process. So that is another adaptation of root hair cells. So lots of mitochondria. Some more adaptations we could put down that we haven't previously mentioned are that the roots are growing continually to find new sources of ions. So roots grow to find new sources. And also the roots tend to branch out. So if you look at a tree trunk, for example, you can see the roots of the tree branching out quite far away from the actual base of the tree. And this is where the roots are growing in order to find new sources of ions and water. By the end of this video, you should be able to describe and explain the process of active transport and also describe the relevant examples that we've used of glucose transport in the small intestine and mineral transport in the roots of plants. So next, I'd recommend to do some questions comparing all three methods of transport, which are diffusion, osmosis, and of course, active transport.